Okay, welcome to part 10. In this part we're going to be outputting the list of conversations and just finishing off the inbox page, and then we are either going to talk about how to decide if a conversation has been read or is unread, because if you remember back from the demonstration we had the unread conversations as bold. So we might do that, or I haven't decided yet, we might do the deleting a conversation. Okay, so before we get onto any of that sort of complicated stuff, what we need to do is have the list of conversations displayed properly. So we're going to use, inside this for each loop, we're going to add another div whose class is going to be conversation without the S, and then inside of here we're going to add our conversation stuff. So the heading is going to be inside of a h2 tag, and this is just going to be the subject. I'm going to link it to a new page called view conversation. So just for now I'm going to use a link tag which doesn't have a specified link. We'll deal with that a bit later on. And the content of this link is going to be the conversation's subject. So we're going to use a bit of PHP here. I'm just going to output the conversation subject. Obviously that needs one of those. Okay, and then underneath the heading we need to output the date of the last reply. We didn't need to, it's just something I thought I'd add for, showing you a nice MySQL function. So we're going to do this inside of a p tag, which is a bit wrong, but we won't worry about that. And we're going to output the last reply and then the date. So we're going to use a bit more PHP here. And we're going to do echo conversation last reply. Okay, obviously this is a timestamp, so one thing we can do is format this using PHP's date function. So we can do that now, and the format we're going to use is d/m/y h I and S, which is day, month, year, hour, minute, second. I is minutes because M was taken first by month, just in case you're wondering. So we should be able to go back to our browser now and reload. Well, let's remove this. That was for sort of debugging. So let's go back to our browser and hit reload, and you can see we now have a slightly nicer looking page, I guess. So the next thing we're going to do, because this message should be unread, is we're going to work out the way to mark, or not mark, I guess, a message as unread. So what we're going to do is go back to our code and the private message backend file. I need to modify our query to check to see if the last date, the last message reply, is greater than the last view time of the user. And if it is, that means the message is unread, because there have been more messages since they last looked at it. So we're just going to duplicate this down, and we're going to add a greater than symbol, and then we're going to get the user's last view time of this conversation, which, if you remember, when we inserted it, was set to 0 for everybody involved. Right, so the conversation, this value comes from the conversation's members, and their column is, well, the column is the conversation last view. I'm going to select this whole line here as conversation unread. Unread, like so. So this is sort of maybe a new thing, so I'll just sort of explain what's going on. What we're doing here is checking a condition with MySQL. So this greater than symbol is sort of the same as if you used that for, like, in part of your where query. So this bit here will either return true or false, which translates to 1 or 0 when you select it, but we don't need to worry about that really. And then we're just giving it a value to make it a bit easier later on. So this effectively is a true or false result, whether or not the message or the conversation is unread. Okay, so then down here we can add, well, we can just add this to our list of return values. So we're going to set this as unread messages, because it doesn't actually mean the conversation is unread, it means that there have been more replies. So unread messages, so a boolean true or false value is equal to row conversation unread. And what we're actually going to do is check this against 1. You could do this by casting this to a bool, like so. However, it does not work all the time, and I can't really remember why, so we're doing it this way. So yeah, that's basically that. But no, seriously, I can't really remember how MySQL works with things like this. So when you use the count function, for example, MySQL actually returns a string, which is a bit weird. So I couldn't entirely remember if this returns as an integer or a boolean or whatever data type. But I know it definitely does equal to 1. It may not be identical to 1, which is what the 3 means. Oops. But it definitely is equal to 1 if it's true. So we're doing this check here as in PHP, and then we're putting the result of that, which will be either true or false, like this. Well, that's true. That's false. True is true. We're putting that into this array key. Okay, so let's just test this by going back to our browser and hitting reload. You can see this page loads, which means there have been no errors in getting the messages, which then means our MySQL query has worked. So then we can go back to our code and our page, which is here, and we can use this to sort of do something else if the conversation has unread messages. So what we're going to do is add a second class to our sort of main outer container for the conversation if there are unread messages. So we're going to use a bit of PHP again. I'm going to do if, and then we're just going to pass in this because this is either true or false. So if conversation unread messages, oops, keep doing that. And if there are, we're just going to do echo unread, which is something I've defined as in CSS, a class that I've defined, which should just make the subject bold. So we can test this out by just going back to our browser and hitting reload, and you can see that this has gone bold because this is an unread message for me. So yeah, that's pretty much that. So yeah, that's the basics of using it, marking it as unread. So the next thing we're going to do is work out we're going to link to the correct page, and then we're going to start on creating the view conversation page. So yeah. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is create a way for the user to delete their messages. So we're going to add that little X that I showed you up here before, and that's going to be processed by this inbox page. So let's just go back to our actual inbox page and we'll add this link. So we're going to bring this down a line here because we're going to add another link above. It just gets a bit long. So just above, we're going to create a new link, href. And this is going to be a link to index.php, and the page is the current page, so page equals inbox. And we also need to specify a variable which means delete whatever ID. Because obviously there's no way to know what they've clicked by the actual link. We actually need to pass in a variable which represents it. And then up here we're going to check for that variable and act accordingly. Anyway, so we're going to create a new variable here called delete conversation, and this is going to be equal to the ID, which I'm going to set as a placeholder ID value, and then we're going to end that tag there, and this is just going to be that little silly X that I used. So in here we need to output the conversation's ID with PHP, so it's just simply echo conversation ID. Right, so we can test this out by reloading the page, and you can see this little X appears. If you look at the bottom of my browser window, it does link to delete conversation equals 1, so that's good. So if we just click that, obviously nothing happens because we haven't programmed anything to happen. So what we need to do is have a check at the top of our page for that, and then we need to validate that the user is actually able to delete that conversation, and if they are, we'll actually delete it. So just up here, we're going to check if is set get, the get variable that we just created, so get delete conversation without the S and without that extra square bracket. And if it is set, we're going to do some sort of error checking stuff. So first check we're going to do is if validate conversation ID, which is a function that we haven't created yet, and all it's going to do is take a conversation ID as its parameter and return if the user is allowed to view that conversation, i.e. they are a member of that conversation. And that's the function we'll create in just a moment. And we're going to pass in the ID that they're trying to delete. So this is the same variable again. No, delete conversation. Okay. And if that is equal to false, it means they can't, or they're not a member of this conversation, and then we're going to cause an error. But the question is, what are we going to do with this error message? We're going to be putting it into an errors array, as always, but this errors array is not defined at the moment, so what we need to do before this is define it. Well, you don't actually need to, but we are going to. So just up here, we're going to do errors equals array, and the reason for this will hopefully become apparent in a moment, but essentially it's because we want to also do another error check to make sure that the user has some messages to view, and if they don't, we'll just show a little message saying, you know, you don't have any messages. So this can't be defined only if they've submitted the delete request, because it's needed in other situations. Anyway, so what we're going to do is add to this errors array down here. I'm just going to say invalid conversation ID, giving away as little information as possible about the fact that they have found a valid ID, but they're just not allowed to view it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is check to see if this error hasn't happened. So we're going to do if empty. I mean, what you could do obviously is just use else here to do the same, have the same effect. But I'm using it the way that I always do, partly for the sake of consistency, but also because using this method, using this method is a little bit easier to add further validation later on if you want to. So say you wanted just to check first that they had actually specified a value, or you wanted to, I don't know, you wanted to do something with the ID before to validate it in some way, then this would provide a sort of easy way to do that with the least amount of actual code modification, because you could just add in another check, if check, you know, that sort of thing. I'm going to delete that now. Okay, there we go. So if there have been no errors, what we're going to do is call another function that we haven't created yet, which is going to be delete conversation, and we're going to pass in the conversation ID, which needs to be deleted. So this just happens to be the same, like that, almost like that. Okay. So what we're going to do in the next part is actually create these functions and test this whole thing out. Okay, so come back for part 11, where we'll make a start on the delete conversation methods.